"Are you lost, Grandpa?" The words cut through the calm of the graduation ceremony like a knife, sharp and filled with the arrogance of youth. John Miller, standing at the edge of the crowd, did not flinch. His hands rested lightly on the worn cane in front of him, the only physical evidence of his many years, but his eyes were focused on the stage. He had seen this day before, in his mind, over and over as he watched his daughter prepare to step into the world. The ceremony, a celebration of her future, was everything he had hoped for her. Yet, even here, among the proud parents and hopeful students, there was no respect for him, not for the man he once was, nor for the man he still carried within. The young Marine in front of him, cocky and full of youthful energy, continued to sneer, oblivious to the depth of the moment. "I don't think you belong here, old man. This is for families, not veterans like you." John smiled softly, a quiet, almost imperceptible gesture, but one that spoke volumes. He had spent years in silence, learning the power of it, letting words and insults fall off like rainwater. The Marine stepped closer, pushing the envelope of disrespect. "You don't belong here. Now move along." Still, John did not move. Instead, he adjusted the old pin on his lapel, a small, weathered symbol that seemed out of place on his otherwise ordinary attire. The young Marine snorted and glanced at his friends, clearly amused. But just as he was about to speak again, a sudden shift in the air caught everyone's attention. A tall, imposing figure entered the ceremony, his presence commanding and undeniable. General Samuel Hawkins, a figure of authority who had once stood side by side with John in the heat of battle, stepped into the scene, his gaze immediately finding John in the crowd. The change was immediate. The Marine, who had been so confident moments ago, stood frozen, his words caught in his throat. The crowd seemed to hold its breath as Hawkins' eyes locked onto John. Without a word, Hawkins began to make his way through the crowd, his footsteps purposeful and heavy. There was no ceremony to his approach, no fanfare, just a slow, deliberate march that spoke of years of command and respect. As Hawkins reached John, the Marine finally realized who he was facing. The words died in his mouth, replaced by a cold sweat that trickled down his back. Hawkins' eyes never wavered from John as he reached out, gently but firmly, acknowledging the years of service and sacrifice that had gone unnoticed by so many. The general's salute, sharp and precise, cut through the air, a gesture of honor that silenced the murmurs around them. The Marine, still in shock, stood there, his mouth agape, as the weight of the moment pressed down on him. The crowd, once buzzing with idle chatter, now stood still, watching in silence as the man they had dismissed revealed his true legacy. "It's an honor, Mr. Miller," Hawkins said, his voice steady, filled with respect and a deep, unspoken history. The Marine, now pale and trembling, had no words left. The old veteran, ignored and belittled, stood tall, his history written not in medals or plaques, but in the quiet reverence of the few who truly understood the cost of sacrifice. The crowd stood in stunned silence, as General Hawkins remained in a sharp salute, his posture unwavering, his respect for John Miller echoing in every corner of the room. The Marine, who moments before had been filled with mockery, now looked as though he had seen a ghost. His face had drained of color, his arrogance shattered. He glanced nervously around at the gathered crowd, whose eyes now flickered between him and John, waiting for something to happen. Hawkins, lowering his hand from his brow, turned his attention to the Marine, his voice cutting through the tension. "You don't know who you're dealing with, do you?" The words were simple, yet their weight was undeniable. The Marine shifted uncomfortably, his face still pale, his earlier bravado nowhere to be found. He stammered, trying to muster a response, but no words came. Hawkins' gaze softened as he turned back to John, his tone shifting. "This man," he said, his voice carrying authority, "is a living legend." The words hung in the air, thick with the history they carried. John, ever the humble man, simply nodded, his eyes glinting with a mixture of pride and sorrow. It wasn't the first time he had been ignored, the first time his service had been overlooked. He had grown accustomed to it over the years, but moments like this reminded him of the silent sacrifices made, the battles fought, not for recognition, but for duty. Hawkins stepped closer to John, his voice lowering to a more personal tone. "You've earned more respect than most will ever know." The world doesn't understand what you've given. John offered a faint smile, as though the words were old friends. He had heard them many times before, but each time they were spoken, they seemed to hold a little more weight. He had spent a lifetime in silence, both as a soldier and as a man, and he had grown to appreciate the quiet moments more than the loud ones. But today, in this moment, there was something different, something real. The Marine, still standing off to the side, felt the sting of his earlier words. He glanced at Hawkins, then back at John, and a sense of humility began to settle over him. He opened his mouth to apologize, but the words felt foreign on his tongue. Instead, he stood there, silent, unsure of how to make amends. Hawkins, seeing the change in the young man, turned to him one last time. "You owe this man more than just an apology," he said firmly, his voice a command that carried through the room. "You owe him your respect, and you will give it now." The Marine, still unsure of what to do, stood at attention, his body rigid as though he were a soldier once again. But this time, he was no longer the one in control. He was the one being humbled. John, noticing the shift in the young man, gave a slight nod. It wasn't an invitation, but a gesture that said everything. The Marine, after a long pause, finally spoke. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't know." John's eyes softened as he met the Marine's gaze. "That's all right, son. You will." The crowd, once awkward and unsure, now seemed to breathe in unison. The tension that had lingered for so long began to dissipate, replaced by a deep, unspoken respect for the old man who had stood silently through the years, and the general who had chosen to honor him in front of all those who had overlooked him. And for a moment, time seemed to stand still. John Miller, a man of quiet dignity, had finally been recognized, not by his medals or his rank, but by the simple truth of who he was, a hero, not just in the battlefield, but in the way he had lived his life. As the ceremony continued, John stood tall, no longer a forgotten man, but a legend, acknowledged at last. The air was thick with silence as the ceremony continued. The crowd had shifted, their attention no longer solely on the stage, but on the moment that had unfolded between General Hawkins, John Miller, and the young Marine. The tension that had once filled the space now hung like a heavy curtain, but there was a quiet understanding that spread through the crowd. They had witnessed something rare, a moment of respect earned, not demanded. Hawkins stepped back, his presence still commanding but now tinged with a quiet reverence for the man standing beside him. John Miller, with his worn, humble appearance, stood tall in the light of recognition. He had lived a lifetime in the shadows, a hero whose battles were fought far from the spotlight. And yet, in this very moment, he was standing in the light, not as a forgotten soldier, but as a man whose legacy was as real as the very ground beneath their feet. The Marine, who had once mocked him, now stood at attention, his face still pale, but filled with something different now: humility. He had learned a valuable lesson that day, one that would follow him for the rest of his life. It was not enough to wear a uniform, to hold rank, to wear the medals. True respect came from understanding the people who wore those uniforms and the stories etched into their lives. The young man, still processing the enormity of the moment, finally took a step forward. "Sir," he said, his voice quiet but steady, "I didn't know." John's eyes softened as he looked at the young Marine. It was a simple statement, one that many others had uttered over the years. But this time, it felt different. John nodded, his expression calm and knowing. "You will," he replied, his voice low but firm, as if he had been waiting for this moment for a long time. Hawkins watched the exchange between the two men, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his lips. This was more than just a moment of recognition. It was a lesson, one that the young Marine would carry with him for the rest of his life. As the ceremony resumed, the air felt lighter, less burdened by the weight of ignorance. John Miller stood there, a quiet force, no longer invisible, no longer overlooked. He had been seen, truly seen, for the first time in a long while. His daughter, still on stage, looked out at her father. A smile touched her lips, one that spoke of pride, of a love that went beyond words. She had always known the man her father was, but today, the world around them saw him, too. The general, who had been the catalyst for this recognition, gave one final nod to John before turning to face the crowd. His voice rang out with the kind of authority that only a man who had seen decades of service could muster. "Let it be known," Hawkins said, his words carrying to every corner of the room, "that true honor is not found in titles or medals, but in the deeds of those who serve without ever asking for recognition." The crowd, moved by the words, stood in respectful silence, a collective acknowledgment of a life lived in service, of sacrifices made that were far greater than the medals they awarded. John Miller, standing at the edge of the crowd, felt the weight of that moment settle in his chest. It was not the applause that mattered, not the recognition, but the knowledge that his story, his sacrifice, had been shared. It had been seen, and for the first time in years, he felt at peace. As the final moments of the ceremony unfolded, the weight of what had just happened began to settle in. John Miller, once just a quiet figure in the background, now stood among the crowd, his heart swelling with a strange mixture of pride and humility. His daughter, still on stage, had caught his eye, her smile broad and filled with unspoken gratitude. She had always known the man her father was, the quiet strength he carried with him. But seeing him recognized today by General Hawkins and the others had brought that knowledge to the forefront in a way she could never have imagined. Her heart swelled with pride as she locked eyes with him, her thoughts echoing his own. He's always been a hero, she thought, but today, the world finally saw it. The Marine who had once mocked him was now standing silently by, his eyes fixed on the ground, a subtle shift in his posture showing a hint of respect, a stark contrast to the cocky young man he had been just an hour earlier. It was clear he would never forget this moment. As the crowd began to disperse, General Hawkins remained for a few moments longer, his eyes occasionally flicking toward John, as though to ensure the gravity of the moment was understood. The general had been in the presence of many great men, but today, there was something different in the air, something powerful in the quiet dignity of John Miller. Hawkins approached John again, his steps slow but deliberate. "You deserve this moment, John," he said, his voice low, just for him. "Not everyone gets the chance to have their story told like this. But you, my friend, have earned it." John gave a small, humble nod, not quite knowing what to say. The words, though appreciated, seemed unnecessary. He had never sought recognition for his service. It had always been about duty, about getting the job done and protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. It was just the way he had lived his life. Yet, in this moment, surrounded by the hum of the crowd and the soft murmur of conversations, he realized how much he had missed hearing those words. General Hawkins turned to leave, but not before giving John a firm, respectful handshake, a gesture that felt like the final seal of approval. John watched as Hawkins made his way back into the crowd, but for the first time in a long while, John did not feel invisible. He felt seen. As the evening wore on, John found himself standing in the background, a quiet observer of the events unfolding around him. His daughter came over to him, her face glowing with pride. "Dad," she said softly, her voice filled with emotion, "you've always been my hero. But today, you've become everyone else's too." John smiled warmly at her, the weight of her words settling deep within his chest. It was a moment of quiet reflection, a reminder that while his service may have been unspoken for so long, it had always been important, always been a part of who he was. As the night continued and the crowd slowly began to thin, John and his daughter stood side by side, the world now a little bit different, a little bit more aware of the quiet hero standing in front of them. As the evening sky darkened and the last of the guests began to leave the graduation ceremony, John Miller found himself standing quietly by the side of the hall. His daughter, still radiant in her graduation gown, was surrounded by friends and well-wishers, laughing and talking excitedly. But John, though proud, stood apart from the crowd, his thoughts lingering on the events of the day. He had never been one for attention, never cared for the spotlight, but today was different. For the first time in a long while, he felt like his life, his sacrifices, had been seen by others. As he stood there, lost in his thoughts, he heard a voice behind him. "You all right, sir?" John turned to find a young man standing there, dressed in a military uniform. His posture was straight, and his expression was respectful, though there was a hint of curiosity in his eyes. John studied the man for a moment before replying, "I'm fine, son. Just thinking." The young man nodded, a quiet understanding passing between them. I saw what happened earlier, he said, his voice lower now, as if speaking to someone who had lived through things he would never understand. I don't think anyone could have expected that. John gave a small smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. You'd be surprised what people expect when they know the right person. The young man hesitated for a moment, then stepped closer. I wanted to say thank you, sir, for what you did, for the sacrifice, for everything. John's gaze softened as he looked at the young soldier. I didn't do it for thanks, he said quietly. I did it because I had to. The young man nodded again, clearly moved by John's words. Still, it means something. More than I think anyone can say. There was a brief silence between them, and then the young man spoke again, this time with more confidence. I'm going into the Marines next month. I want to be like you, someone who makes a difference, someone who stands up for what's right. John studied him for a moment, as though measuring the sincerity in his words. You will, he said, his voice steady. But remember, it's not about the medals, or the rank, or the applause. It's about the men and women you fight beside, and the difference you make in their lives. That's the only thing that matters. The young man nodded, a look of determination crossing his face. I'll remember that. I promise. John smiled, his eyes filled with a quiet pride. He had seen so many young faces come and go over the years, each with their own dreams and ambitions. Some would make it, others wouldn't, but every one of them mattered. As the young man walked away, John turned his attention back to his daughter, who was now making her way toward him. She had finished talking with her friends and was headed toward him, a smile on her face. As she approached, she wrapped her arms around him, pulling him into a warm embrace. I'm so proud of you, Dad, she said softly. John held her for a moment longer than usual, savoring the feeling of having her close. I'm proud of you too, kiddo, he replied, his voice thick with emotion. For a moment, everything else faded away, and it was just the two of them, father and daughter, standing together in the soft glow of the evening. There was no need for grand speeches or accolades. In that simple moment, everything they had been through, everything they had sacrificed, was enough. As they stood there, the world around them seemed to quiet, the noise of the day falling away until there was nothing left but the bond they shared. And in that silence, John Miller knew that he had done his duty, not for recognition, but for the people who mattered most to him. The ceremony, the recognition, it was all just a moment that would fade, but the love and respect between them would last forever. As the night wore on and the last of the guests made their way home, John Miller found himself alone on the porch of his daughter's house, the soft hum of crickets filling the quiet evening air. He leaned back in the rocking chair, his hands resting on the arms, his mind far from the excitement of the day. The ceremony was over, the applause had faded, and now, it was just him, alone with his thoughts. The weight of what had happened still lingered, but it was a strange, peaceful kind of weight. For so many years, he had carried the silence, the forgotten history, the invisible burdens of a life spent in service. Today, for the first time in what felt like forever, he had been seen, truly seen, for who he was and what he had done. And though he hadn't asked for it, he found himself grateful for the recognition. He thought about the young Marine, the one who had mocked him earlier in the day. The apology was simple, but it had been enough. It was a moment of humility for both of them, one that would stay with the Marine for the rest of his life. And John had learned long ago that it wasn't the apologies that mattered. It was the change, the realization that the lessons had been understood. A quiet sigh escaped his lips as he looked up at the stars, the vast sky stretching out above him. He thought about the life he had lived, the battles fought, the men and women he had served beside, the friends he had lost. They were all with him, in his memories, in the small details of his life. He had always carried them with him, even when no one else could see them. Now, it seemed, those memories had come to life again. They had been acknowledged. John smiled softly, his heart swelling with a quiet pride. His daughter came out onto the porch, her eyes searching for him in the dim light. She paused for a moment, then walked over and sat beside him. I think we should go for a walk, she said gently, her voice warm and comforting. Just the two of us. I know you've been quiet all day. Maybe a walk will help. John nodded without a word, his eyes never leaving the stars above. He had never been one for long speeches, never one for grand gestures. But there was something in the simplicity of the moment that spoke volumes. The two of them walked together in silence, side by side, as the cool evening air wrapped around them. It wasn't about words. It was about the connection they shared, the unspoken bond that had always been there. For the first time in a long time, John felt a sense of peace, not because the world had changed, but because he had finally found a place where he truly belonged. As they walked, the memories of the day faded into the background, replaced by something more important, the quiet, steady rhythm of life. And in that moment, John Miller knew that, no matter what had happened before, he was exactly where he needed to be. He had given everything he had, and he had come home. The next morning, the sun had risen slowly over the horizon, casting a warm golden light on the quiet town. John Miller sat at the kitchen table, a mug of coffee in front of him, the soft clink of the spoon as he stirred the drink, the only sound in the room. His daughter had already left for work, but the house felt peaceful, still, as if the weight of the past few days had settled into a kind of quiet harmony. He gazed out the window, watching the birds fly by, the world outside moving with its usual rhythm, but inside, there was a quiet shift in the air. The events of yesterday were still fresh in his mind, but they no longer felt like a burden. They had become a part of him, woven into the fabric of his life, a reminder that, sometimes, recognition came in unexpected ways. The knock on the door broke his reverie. John set down his coffee and rose slowly, his joints creaking as he moved. He opened the door to find a man in his mid-30s standing there, dressed in civilian clothes, his posture straight, and his eyes filled with something John couldn't quite place. "Sir, are you John Miller?" the man asked, his voice respectful but with a hint of hesitation. John nodded, studying the man carefully. "I am. Can I help you?" The man hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath. "My name is Mark Stevens. I'm with the Department of Veterans Affairs. I've been trying to track you down for a while now." John's brows furrowed slightly. He had heard of the VA, of course, but he hadn't thought much about it in years. "Why?" he asked simply. Stevens shifted his weight, looking slightly uncomfortable. "We've been reviewing records, and we noticed something about your service. It's not in the public record, but we believe it's time you received the proper recognition." John's heart skipped a beat, but he didn't show it. He had lived through so many years of silence, so many moments where his service had gone unnoticed, that he didn't know how to react to this unexpected turn of events. "What kind of recognition?" he asked, his voice steady despite the sudden rush of emotions. Stevens looked down at his clipboard for a moment, then met John's gaze. "We believe it's time to officially recognize your actions during the Vietnam War. The work you did with the Special Forces, it was extraordinary. You should have been awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, but it was never processed. We're here to fix that." John's mind raced, his heart pounding in his chest. He had never expected anything like this. The memories of the war, of the men he had lost, of the battles fought in the heat of the jungle, all came rushing back. He had never wanted the medals or the recognition. Those days were behind him. But now, standing in front of him, was a chance to finally receive something he had never sought. A part of him wanted to refuse, to tell Stevens that it was too late, that it didn't matter anymore. But another part of him, the part that had lived through so much, knew this was something more than just a medal. It was a moment of closure, a way to honor the fallen and the sacrifices made. "I never asked for any of that," John said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Stevens nodded, understanding. "I know, but sometimes, even the quietest heroes need to be recognized." John stood in silence for a moment, the weight of Stevens' words settling in. Finally, he spoke again, his voice steady but full of the years of experience that had shaped him. "I've done my part. If this is something that's right, then I'll accept it. But it's not just for me. It's for the men I served with, the ones who never made it back. They're the real heroes." Stevens smiled softly, his respect for John growing. "Of course, sir. You'll get the recognition you deserve. It's time the world knew the truth." As Stevens turned to leave, John stood at the door, watching him go. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace, a quiet certainty that, no matter what had happened in the past, he had finally been seen. He had finally been recognized. And in that moment, he knew that his story, his legacy, was more than just his own. It belonged to the men he had fought beside, to the sacrifices they had all made, and to the quiet courage that had kept them going, even when the world had forgotten them. Weeks passed, and life slowly returned to a quiet rhythm for John Miller. His daughter had moved on with her life, still making regular visits, and the house was once again filled with the subtle sounds of everyday life. The recognition from the Department of Veterans Affairs had come through, just as Stevens had promised. John had not sought out the ceremony, nor had he invited the press, but the news still spread. A quiet hero had been finally acknowledged, and the world began to see John Miller for who he truly was. The day the medal arrived, John held it in his hand, the weight of the Distinguished Service Cross heavier than he had imagined. He didn't know if he would ever wear it, but the act of holding it felt like a full-circle moment. It wasn't about the medal. It was about the recognition of his brothers in arms, the ones who never returned, the ones who had never been acknowledged. His fingers traced the cold metal, and he thought about the faces of those he had served with, the ones he had lost, the ones who had carried the weight of their own silent battles. As John sat by the window, the sunlight streaming in, he could hear the distant sound of children playing outside. The world continued. Life moved on. But for him, in this small moment, everything felt still, like time had paused just for him. His phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was a message from Stevens, a simple note that read, "I hope you're doing well, sir. Just wanted to check in." John smiled to himself and typed a quick response. "I'm fine, Mark. Thank you for everything." He set the phone down and turned his attention back to the small garden outside. The grass was green, the flowers in full bloom, and for the first time in years, John felt at peace with the world around him. His life had been full of struggles, of unseen battles fought in silence. But in this moment, he realized that his fight was over. It wasn't about the awards, the medals, or the public recognition. It was about the quiet respect he had earned from those who knew him best, from those who understood what it meant to serve. As the days went by, John continued to live his life quietly, content with the knowledge that his service had been honored. He spent more time with his daughter, watching her grow and achieve her own dreams, and they shared many quiet moments together. His daughter had always been his greatest pride, and now, he could see her walking the path he had hoped for her. The world had changed in ways he never expected. He had been seen, his legacy had been recognized, and though he would never seek the spotlight, he knew that the shadows he had once lived in had faded, replaced by a quiet, lasting respect. One afternoon, as he sat on the porch watching the sunset with his daughter beside him, she turned to him with a thoughtful expression. "Dad," she said, "you've always taught me that it's not about what people say or think about you. It's about who you are when no one is watching. And I think that's why you're such a great man." John smiled, the warmth of her words settling deep in his heart. "I've always tried to live by that, sweetheart. And I'm proud of you, more than you'll ever know." They sat in silence as the sky turned shades of orange and pink, the world around them peaceful and still. John Miller had lived a life full of challenges, but now, in this quiet moment, he could finally say that he was content. He had done his part, fought his battles, and now, it was time for him to enjoy the peace he had earned. The rest of the world could move on, but for him, in this small corner of it, life was exactly as it should be. Months passed, and life continued on its steady course for John Miller. His daughter had moved forward with her life, and though they still shared quiet moments, it was clear that both of them were adjusting to a new sense of normal. John spent his days tending to his garden, the rhythm of his hands in the soil soothing his mind. The flowers he had planted bloomed with each passing season, much like the peace he had found within himself. The Distinguished Service Cross, which now sat in a small, unassuming box on his mantel, had become a quiet symbol of a life well lived, a life that had been seen, recognized, and now honored, not in a grand ceremony, but in the simple acknowledgment of those who mattered. One afternoon, as John sat on his porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Mark Stevens, the man from the Department of Veterans Affairs who had helped facilitate the recognition. "Sir, I just wanted to check in. Hope you're doing well." John smiled softly, his fingers hovering over the phone as he considered his reply. It wasn't often he received messages like this, especially not from someone like Stevens, but he had come to appreciate the gesture. He typed a brief reply. "I'm doing well, Mark. Thank you for everything." He set the phone down and looked out over the peaceful evening. He had come to terms with the recognition, understanding that it wasn't about the medal itself, but about the people who had fought beside him and the legacy they had shared. As the evening wore on, John couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought him here. He had seen much in his life, the struggles, the loss, the sacrifices, but he had also witnessed the resilience of the human spirit, the quiet strength that emerged in the face of adversity. It was these lessons that had shaped him, and now, as he sat in the quiet of his home, he realized that he was content. The world had moved on, but for him, peace had finally settled in. That night, as he lay in bed, he thought of the young Marine from the graduation ceremony, the one who had mocked him only to later apologize. It had been a simple moment, one that had changed everything for the young man, and John felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that he had made a difference in someone's life. The next morning, as John enjoyed his coffee on the porch, his daughter came outside, her smile bright as ever. She had always been his greatest source of pride, and as she sat next to him, he felt the warmth of their connection. "Dad," she said, her voice gentle, "I've been thinking. I know you don't want attention, but I think we should do something for you. You deserve it." John turned to her, his heart full as he looked into her eyes. "I've already gotten everything I need, sweetheart. All I wanted was for you to be happy, to live your life without worry." She nodded, her eyes softening with understanding. "I know, Dad. But still, I think you should know how much you mean to me, to all of us." John smiled, a feeling of contentment washing over him. He had lived his life the way he had chosen, with humility, with purpose, and now he could finally rest, knowing that his story had been told, that his legacy would live on in the hearts of those who loved him. The days continued to pass, each one just like the last, but John found joy in the simplicity of life, the quiet moments spent in his garden, the shared laughter with his daughter, the peace that came with knowing that he had done his part, that he had fought for what was right, and that he had been recognized for it in his own way. And as the years went by, John Miller's name may not have been etched in history books, but it was etched in the hearts of those who knew him, and that was enough. As the years went by, John Miller's life continued on in its quiet, steady way. The recognition he had received, the acknowledgment of his service, had slowly faded into the background, becoming just another part of his history, like the many other moments that had shaped him. He didn't need the attention. He didn't need the accolades. What mattered was that he had done his duty, and now he could rest. His daughter, now fully settled into her life, continued to visit regularly, and they shared the same quiet moments they always had. The two of them would sit on the porch in the evening, watching the sunset, talking about life, and simply being in each other's company. It was enough. It always had been. One afternoon, as John sat in his favorite chair by the window, looking out over the yard, he found himself thinking back to the days of his service, to the men he had served with, and to the friendships that had shaped him. Those days seemed so distant now, yet they still lived with him, like shadows in the corners of his mind. His fingers brushed lightly over the old wooden table beside him, the same table that had been passed down through generations. It was a piece of his past, much like the memories that still lingered. Despite the peace he had found, there was always a part of him that would never fully be able to let go of the weight of those years. But it was a weight he had come to accept. He had done his part, and the rest, as far as he was concerned, was history. The doorbell rang, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a sound that, over the years, had become almost second nature to him. The arrival of a visitor, a sign that life was still moving, still evolving. John stood slowly, his joints creaking as he made his way to the door. When he opened it, he was surprised to find a man standing there in uniform. The man looked familiar, but John couldn't quite place him at first. "Sir," the man said, his voice respectful but tinged with uncertainty. "I hope I'm not disturbing you. My name is Lieutenant James Carter. I've been asked to come by and deliver this." He held out an envelope, sealed with the official markings of the Department of Veterans Affairs. John raised an eyebrow, taking the envelope from the young man's hand. "What's this about?" he asked, his voice steady, though a hint of curiosity lingered. "It's about your Distinguished Service Cross, sir," Lieutenant Carter explained. "There's been a revision in the records, and we need your signature for the official documentation." John nodded slowly, a part of him surprised that this recognition, even after all these years, was still ongoing. He glanced at the envelope in his hand, then at the young man standing before him. "I never asked for any of this," John said softly, his voice not full of regret, but with a quiet humility. I know, sir, Lieutenant Carter said, nodding in understanding. But the records weren't complete, and the recognition wasn't fully processed. This is just the final step. John stood there for a moment, his eyes scanning the letter, then finally looked up at the young man. I suppose I owe it to my brothers to finish this, he said, his voice quiet but firm. But for me, it's done. I don't need the world to remember. I just need to know that the ones I served with are at peace. Lieutenant Carter nodded again, respecting the gravity of John's words. Thank you, sir, he said, his voice filled with admiration. You've done more than enough. As John signed the documents, he felt a sense of closure, a quiet acknowledgment of the life he had lived, the sacrifices he had made. The world may not have always seen it, but he had done his part, and that was enough for him. After the lieutenant left, John returned to his chair by the window, the weight of the moment still resting on his shoulders. But this time, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a final piece falling into place. Life had come full circle, and John Miller, the quiet hero, had finally found the peace he had longed for. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow across the yard. John smiled softly, knowing that, in his own way, he had done what he set out to do. His journey had been long and full of sacrifice, but now, it was over. And in this quiet, simple moment, that was all that mattered. Years passed, and John Miller's life settled into a rhythm that had become familiar to him. The world had moved on, as it always did, but for him, there was a sense of closure now. He still spent his days in the garden, tending to the plants, watching as they grew and bloomed. It was a peaceful existence, one that brought him a sense of calm he had always sought but never fully understood until now. His daughter had started her own family, and though they lived in different cities, she made sure to visit often. It was on one such visit that John found himself reflecting on everything that had transpired in the years since he had been recognized. His service, once a quiet part of his life that he never spoke of, had been acknowledged, not by the world, not by anyone who mattered, but by the ones who had the power to understand. And that was enough. Sitting at the kitchen table, John looked out the window, his mind wandering back to the days when he had worn the uniform, when every decision, every action, was measured in lives saved and lost. He thought about the men he had served with, the ones he had promised to remember. They were always with him, in the quiet moments, in the spaces between the words. A moment, they sat in silence, watching the world around them. The children had run off to play, and the soft evening breeze blew through the trees, rustling the leaves. John Miller, the quiet man who had once walked the hard path of service and sacrifice, sat contentedly in the warmth of the setting sun, surrounded by his family. He had made it through the battles, both on the field and off, and now, in the peace of this moment, he knew that everything he had done had led him here, to this simple, perfect place. The world could go on, and he would remain, content with the knowledge that his legacy had been passed on, not in grand gestures, but in the love and respect of those who mattered most. John Miller had never been one for big celebrations. His life had always been more about quiet moments, the soft comfort of familiarity, and the warmth of family. Yet, as the years passed, those quiet moments became more precious to him than ever. It was a crisp fall morning when he found himself once again sitting on the porch, his hands wrapped around a warm mug of coffee. The cool air had a sharpness to it that reminded him of his younger days, when the world seemed to be full of endless possibilities, each day a new challenge. But now, in his later years, the challenges had slowed, replaced by the gentle rhythm of life that came with age. His daughter was now living in her own home, raising her family, but their bond remained strong, a thread that had never wavered, no matter how much time passed. As he sat there, John reflected on everything that had happened in the past few years. The recognition he had received from the Department of Veterans Affairs had never been something he sought, yet it had brought a sense of closure he hadn't realized he needed. It wasn't about the medal or the formalities. It was about finally being seen, not for the uniform he once wore, but for the man he had become. The phone rang, its sharp tone cutting through the peaceful silence of the morning. John picked it up, surprised to see a familiar name on the caller ID. Hello, this is John Miller. Mr. Miller, it's Mark Stevens from the Department of Veterans Affairs, the voice on the Other end said, I hope I'm not disturbing you. Not at all, Mark, John replied, his voice steady, though he felt a small flutter of curiosity. What's going on? I just wanted to check in, Mark said. I know it's been a while since the last time we spoke, but we've been working on some updates to your records. I wanted to see how you're doing, and if there's anything more we can do for you. John paused for a moment, taking a breath. It was strange, hearing from Mark after all this time. He had thought that chapter of his life was closed. I'm doing well, Mark, John finally said. I found my peace, and I appreciate everything you did. There was a slight hesitation on the other end of the line before Mark spoke again. I'm glad to hear that, sir, he said. But I wanted to tell you that we've been working on something important. It's not about the medal or the formal recognition. It's something much more personal. John felt a stirring of curiosity. What do you mean, he asked. Mark's voice lowered slightly, as if he were sharing something confidential. We've uncovered some records that show just how much you did, not just in your service, but in your impact on others. Your story is more than just a chapter in a book. It's something that has inspired people in ways you can't even imagine. John sat back in his chair, his mind racing. He had never thought of himself as a source of inspiration. He had done what he had to do, that was all. Mark, I don't know what to say, John admitted, his voice soft. I never asked for any of this. I just did my part. There was a moment of silence before Mark spoke again, his voice filled with understanding. I know, sir. But sometimes, people like you, people who do the right thing, no matter the cost, don't always get the recognition they deserve in their time. But that doesn't mean they don't leave a lasting legacy. John nodded slowly, his fingers tightening around the mug in his hands. I understand, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But I don't need anything more. I've had my share of battles, and I've lived a good life. What matters to me now is my family, my daughter, and the peace I've found. Mark paused for a moment, then said, I understand, Mr. Miller, and I respect that. But I just wanted to let you know that your legacy, what you've done for this country and for those who serve with you, it matters. It always will. John smiled softly, his heart swelling with pride and gratitude. Thank you, Mark. That means more than you'll ever know. As they exchanged goodbyes, John sat back, reflecting on the conversation. The recognition, the acknowledgment, it had never been something he had sought, but now, hearing Mark's words, he realized that perhaps his story had mattered in ways he couldn't have imagined. He had lived his life with humility, never asking for anything more than to do his duty. But in the quiet of this moment, he understood that his legacy was not just in the medal he had received, but in the people he had impacted along the way. And for that, he was content. The years continued to unfold, each one passing with the gentle rhythm of a quiet life. John Miller had come to accept that the grand moments of his past were behind him, and now, his days were filled with the simple pleasures of family, nature, and reflection. His daughter's family had grown, and with it, the house seemed fuller, the laughter more frequent. Yet, there remained a quiet peace within him, a contentment that could only come from living a life true to oneself. One afternoon, as John sat on the porch enjoying the gentle breeze, his granddaughter, now a teenager, came to sit beside him. She had always been a curious child, asking questions that made John smile. Grandpa, she said, looking at him with the kind of seriousness that only young people could carry. What was it like when you were in the military? What did you do? John took a moment before responding, his eyes shifting to the horizon as he gathered his thoughts. I did what I had to do, he said simply. It was a different time, a different world. But we all did our part, because it was the right thing to do. His granddaughter seemed to process his words, her brow furrowed in thought. Were you scared? She asked, her voice soft. John chuckled lightly, the sound rough with age. Fear is a part of it. But you learn to live with it, to push through it. The real strength comes from the people you're with, the ones who have your back. It's about knowing you're not alone. She nodded, taking in his words. There was a long pause before she spoke again, this time with a spark of curiosity in her voice. Do you think people will ever really understand what you did? I mean, you're a hero, Grandpa. You save people. John looked at her, his heart swelling with pride. Hero, he repeated, a soft smile crossing his face. I don't think of myself as a hero. I just did what needed to be done. The real heroes are the ones who never made it back. He paused, his thoughts drifting for a moment to the men he had served with, the ones whose names were carved into his memory, and whose sacrifices would never be forgotten. But if you're asking whether I think people will understand, well, maybe not fully. It's hard for anyone who hasn't lived through it to truly get it. But that's okay. What matters is that we remember, that we honor those who came before us. His granddaughter was silent for a moment, reflecting on his words. I think I understand, she said finally, her voice steady. You didn't need recognition. You just wanted to do the right thing. And you did. John nodded slowly, his gaze returning to the garden that stretched out before him. Exactly, he said quietly. I did what I could. And that's all anyone can do. As the afternoon sun began to set, casting a warm glow across the yard, John Miller sat back, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. The world had given him many challenges, but it had also given him moments like this, moments of connection, of understanding. He had lived a life full of sacrifice and service, but now, in his later years, he had found the peace he had always sought. There were no grand parades, no loud celebrations, just the quiet satisfaction of knowing he had done his part, and that those who mattered most understood the value of his journey. And in that quiet peace, John knew that his story, though perhaps never fully understood by the world, would live on in the hearts of those he had touched. His legacy was not in medals or accolades, but in the lives he had influenced, the love he had given, and the memories he had created. As the night fell, and the sounds of the day gave way to the stillness of evening, John Miller sat in the company of his family, content with the knowledge that his place in the world had been more than enough.